The first shot I'm going to analyse is when the protagonist punches and he kind of aims towards the screen, which is something that's seen in a lot of horror movies, and particularly in Spider-Man 2 on this fight scene in the train. The kind of like punch towards at the audience, which I think engages the audience, which is why it's used in a lot of fight scenes. I think you can see in mine he's definitely positioned to the right, whereas Spider-Man it's more centred. I did this differently because I wanted my character to look a little less powerful than obviously the antagonist in Spider-Man. Another difference between the two shots is that my shot is right at the beginning of the sequence, whereas the Spider-Man one is like really like sandwiched between a lot of other shots. And I think with mine, I did that because you can't tell who we're punching towards it. You don't know the full story yet because it's an opening sequence, whereas this shot looking at is like in the middle of the film. In my sequence, when the character punches, you can see both the characters quite clearly on either side of the screen, whereas some of the shots in Spider-Man, he's centred and it looks like we're attacking him. I chose this difference because obviously my section of fighting is a lot shorter and I wanted to use a lot more variety in shots, which isn't as easy when there's a short amount of time, so I couldn't really repeat shot types that I'd done. Another film I compared mine with was Kick-Ass, because I thought this was a lot more relatable to my characters, because my characters are dressing up as superheroes when they're not really, and so is the characters in Kick-Ass, so I thought the costumes would be more relatable, and I thought that the shot types would show the same kind of characteristics. In one of the fight scenes in Kick-Ass, he's on the floor, and this is very similar to one of the shots I used, where one of the characters is lying after being attacked. You can see in this reaction shot that the camera's a lot more shaky on Kick-Ass rather than my film, because the violence is supposedly real, whereas in mine the characters are only pretending. So I wanted to keep this calmness in the scene. I didn't want it to look too realistic because we're not allowed. If you look at these two shots, you can see that Kick-Ass is kind of cowering, whereas my character is laid down. That's because mine's been knocked out and his hasn't. It's more of a reaction to the violence. So other than that, I try to keep the shots very identical. I used a slight tilt on the shot because it makes it look a bit more like chaotic on the characters, and the violence, like, it just looks a little bit more serious, I guess. I decided to use an over-the-shoulder shot in my film, just like in this scene from Spider-Man, because I thought that it's a good way to get both like the protagonist and the antagonist in the same shot, or all the characters that you want. It also means you can kind of see it from the character's point of view and what they're looking at, but at the same time you've still got that omniscience of the audience being able to see the whole situation. Unlike Spider-Man, I positioned mine in the centre so I could get both characters on either side. Obviously he's only fighting one person, so they've kind of positioned it right and left. I also thought it was kind of important to use the close-up shots, like extreme close-ups of the characters, because it really gets the detail on the face and like what they're wearing if you weren't quite sure. It also provides like the variety of shots that you need in a film to give the viewer like the full experience. I positioned my character in the centre. In Spider-Man he's kind of positioned to the right, but I think either way these are kind of a similar effect because it orientates the viewer and you really can see the expression on the characters' faces in this particular scene. In these shots you can see the characters kind of interacting but not actually fighting. I did this differently to Spider-Man because they kind of do a shot reverse shot, whereas I just kept it in one shot and you can see the reaction of both characters without changing shots. I mainly did this for time, but I also thought that by keeping the shots simple, it was because of their simple like outlook, because they're not really superheroes, it was better suited to them. Another reaction shot used in this was I thought it was important to use like a medium close-up to get the expression on the faces, and in Kick-Ass you can see that they do this too, but the duration of the shot is much shorter. In the time that my shot takes place you can get about 4 or 5 shots in the Kick-Ass. I think this is done because the Kick-Ass is much more upbeat and faster when it comes to the music as well. Kick-Ass is a much faster paced fight, so the reaction shots are going to be a lot faster, and I think that's one thing that I thought I'd challenge and like keep quite slow, and like it really, you can take in everything because it is the start of the film and a lot of the characters need to be identified with. Obviously when it comes to my fight scenes, they're not real, these are characters playing and pretending, whereas in Kick-Ass it's supposedly real violence, so there is quite a strong difference in shots and like how fast the pace is. because I wanted it to still follow the codes and conventions of violence in films, I still use similar shots. You can see in this shot that she's clearly hitting him, and he's on the right because obviously he's less powerful if he's being hurt by her, and I've used the same kind of codes and convention. I've used him on the right because he's being knocked out by this other character even though they're not actually touching. So that's how I tried to keep it similar to the real kind of violence that you get in films. When you go through the shots of the film and when they do fight, you can clearly see that they're not touching each other and they're not actually hitting. That's important because I wanted to get across in the film that it's not really happening and that you need to understand that these characters aren't really superheroes, unlike the violence in the other films where there's clear points of contact like that have been used with special effects. For example, when you compare these two shots, you can see that in the Kick-Ass shot, she's clearly interacting with him, whereas in my shot, his fist is at least a foot away from the actual point of contact. One important thing with the sound in this film is that compared to Kick-Ass, which is very upbeat and very loud and very unavoidable that you can't help but hear it, mine is much more subtle and in the background in a way. Like, you're much more concentrated on what's happening in the shots. The Kick-Ass one thing that I have done similar is that I've tried to keep the beat strong and like keep the pace up, which is something that they do in Kick-Ass, and it kind of follows the shots as well. Like, the shots will move when the music moves. Which is something that I tried to do throughout my sequence, regardless of whether it's in the fight scene. With Spider-Man, it's a very different kind of superhero film. So the music's much more orchestral, and like in the second part of the fight sequence, I kind of put in that kind of string feel. That, having said this, towards the end you can hear the birds kind of tweeting, and that's kind of a link I use to bring back the audience to this reality and not this fantasy that these teenagers live in. When comparing these two shots together, you can see that like both angles give it that dominating effect, and then you get the other high angle looking down on the other one, which makes it look vulnerable. So you have the two different sides, and you can clearly see who's in power, which is, I obviously matches to Kick-Ass because it's done in quite a lot of films. Dressing my characters, I had them wear a mask and bright coloured leggings, which is like Spider-Man with his bright colours, because it obviously shows superheroes, which is why I have like the red and the different colours. But obviously since mine were only dressing up, it was a bit comical, and you had the underpants on top of the tights, much like in Kick-Ass. It looks like ridiculous.
SK Billy's super sound of the 70s weekend just keeps on trucking.
Obviously the start of Reservoir Dogs and my sequence are very similar. You have kind of the beat where the titles come in, and then you get the walking across in slow motion. So I tried to use similar music, and I also tried to kind of copy that style. My film's very similar because the walking from the right to the left, and I think it's a really good way of introducing each character one by one. Like, you've got the chance to look at each one as they're walking on screen. And it's a very iconic scene from Reservoir Dogs, and it's obviously really effective. So I used it twice because I thought that would be more effective. One difference that I tried to make between Reservoir Dogs and mine is that they use a lot of the same angles, and I tried to vary up a bit, getting ones from behind and in front and all four of the cast at the same time, whereas they just got the one shot of one person at a time, which is obviously really good for introducing, but it's not what I wanted to do. They, obviously you can see in this that it's the same one every time, like they're in the centre and you can just see the shoulders, whereas mine you've got all different varies and you've got all four, and I just think it works better to introduce characters and see where they stood in line. I tried to keep to the codes and conventions of other films and their logos by having some kind of image and the text on top. I also thought it was important to animate it because you kind of got the entrance of the text and then the exit. I made mine a lot shorter than some professional ones because theirs was more for a really long film and I was trying to just do it for my film opening and it had to be under 2 minutes.